Can you ever really be happy with a lifted Toyota Tacoma? Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Robmotive. So the big question, can you ever really be happy with a lifted Toyota Tacoma? You know, first of all, I'm going to answer that right off. The answer is no, not really. Now, there's a few reasons for that. You know, I was under the illusion that I could lift my Toyota Tacoma and everything would be great. It'd be just like stock. You know, you can get it right. No problems at all. Well, I've discovered over the years, after lifting my third Toyota Tacoma, that that's not necessarily true. It isn't true at all. Now, I'm going to start with my most recent Tacoma because I've said on the channel that it feels just like stock and there's no issues with it. That is true. The reason that I can't be happy with it is because I want it to be taller. You know, all I went with was a level kind of setup, if you will, in the front. Almost 2 inches to kind of raise the front up a little bit to level out the truck. Because if you didn't know, the Tacoma has a rake to it. It kind of points down in the front. So I put that on and I like it. And it really does ride well. No issues with it. But the problem is I want it to be higher. It just doesn't look tough enough, aggressive enough to me, the way that it is. I mean, it looks good, but it just doesn't have that in-your-face, tough look that I like out of the truck. Like the Voodoo Blue one that I had before. That thing looked tough, even though it had a negative rake and the front end was popped up too far. Another mistake that I had made. But there are a couple of things, it seems to me, that people always run into. And if you push people, if you really press them, when you ask them if they've had any troubles, eventually you're going to get to the truth. Because it's always the first inclination, I guess, to say that, no, there's no problems, it's perfect, nothing's wrong. That's not true. If you go with what I believe is the most popular setup out there, and that's a 3-2 lift, bringing the front up 3 inches and bringing the rear up 2 inches, then you're going to run into a couple of issues. Number one, depending on the tires that you go with, your wheel and tire setup, you're probably going to have a rub. And I say that because most people don't lift their truck and then leave the little donut looking tires on. They go with like a 285/70 R17, R18, something bigger. And when you do that, you're inevitably gonna have a rub during certain situations. That's the way it was for me. When I did my first lift, which was on the Barcelona Red 2018 Tacoma, it was a sport. It was fine when I drove out of the shop until I made a turn somewhere over a dip, if you will, and then I had a rub. I had a rub because there wasn't enough room for those tires. The shop should have told me that, but they didn't. I guess it's so accepted out there that if you do a lift on a Tacoma, you're going to have a rub, that they don't feel it's necessary to let you know. What about the cab mount chop? To me, that's one of the scariest things that you can do. When you start grinding away and cutting that pinch weld or the cab mount area, I don't dig that. You know, I'm really not into chopping off hunks of metal on the truck just so I can have bigger tires. I know a lot of people do it. A lot of people say they don't have problems, and that's cool. If you're comfortable with it, as any other mod, then go ahead and do it. But me, I don't like doing that. It never looks good. It always looks like it's been hacked off, unless you have somebody that's really good at doing it and repaints it and sands it and then you get into big money, right? What about the fenders? You know, I've seen people rubbing the inner liner, and their answer has been to remove that inner fender liner. Well, it's there for a reason, right? It's there to keep water and gunk from getting up into the engine bay and mucking up everything that's under there. You don't want that, especially just to add a bigger tire. Now, you can do other things. I've seen people chop those up in areas. Have you ever seen anybody's fender liner where they've tried to cut out just the areas where the tires actually rub? It looks like a checkerboard under there. You got a little piece cut out here, kind of a void. You got a piece cut out here. To me, that's worse than a Band-Aid. You know, you're not solving the problem. You're just getting rid of something that's in the way, and it doesn't look good. I suppose it would be okay if that inner fender was like a mesh, a uniform mesh all the way through. That would be okay, because then it would at least look uniform. But when you have missing chunks here and there, it just doesn't look right. It's not a good thing to do. Another thing for me is the comfort of it. You know, the truck, while it's not a Lexus, it's not a Mercedes, it does ride relatively comfortably from the factory with the stock setup, the stock wheels and tires, the current suspension that it has, or the OEM suspension. When you go to the lifted setup, you're going to have a firmer suspension. I don't care what you do, it's going to be firmer. That means when you hit those bumps, those divots, maybe potholes, depending on where you live, it's going to be a much firmer ride. Now, if you don't care about that, you know, you like your truck to be tough and rugged and rough, and then that's okay. But I don't like that, and I've never liked that. You know, I like a smooth ride, probably because some of my first vehicles were horrible. Worn out shocks, worn out struts. They would rub the whole tire in the fender well because they had no support. When you went over bumps and things, or even railroad tracks, and railroad tracks are the worst if you're in a Tacoma that has problems. I'll tell you, I had an issue in my Voodoo Blue Tacoma, and I think it was railroad tracks that caused a failure. I went over some railroad tracks one day, and that thing bounced and heaved like you wouldn't believe. I was probably going too fast. And I discovered later on that I had a leak underneath on the CV axle boot. It had torn. And I think that's because it jolted it around so violently that it actually impacted the boot somehow and tore the boot. And what a drag that was. It was horrible. Couldn't believe that it happened to my truck. You know, I had heard about it. I didn't think the angle was too bad. But after looking at it, I think it was. My CV axle was, you know. The other thing, and the last thing that I'll mention, is that needle bearing. You know, it's a drag to have to mess with stuff like that. And I think if you go much above 3 inches, maybe even above 2.5 inches, sooner or later you're going to have some sort of a needle bearing problem. You're going to have to replace that thing or correct the geometry of your lift. Gonna have to do something. Now, if you can do it yourself, that's not too bad. Still something you have to mess with, but you're gonna spend somewhere between, I believe it's $500 and $1,000, depending on what part of the country you live in and who's doing the work. You're gonna have to spend that kind of money to fix something that in essence you caused. What a bummer. Anyway, I don't care what lift you have. I don't care what you do, unless you go very, very small. You're never going to be comfortable with a lift on your Toyota Tacoma. It's never going to be like stock. It's always going to be firmer and probably cause you problems down the road. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And be honest. Am I wrong? Can you honestly tell me that you've never had any problems and it's as comfortable as it was before? I'd be curious to know. Also, real quick, I do have 2 additional channels. Robmotive JT, all about Jeep Gladiators, currently the Jeep Gladiator Mojave, and Robmotive MT, all about compact trucks, currently the Hyundai Santa Cruz. Check them out, and if you're interested, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. Bye.